My uncle and aunt stole my $300,000 inheritance from my parents. But what happened next shocked me even more. The smell of old paper and leather binding still lingers in my nose as I stand in the empty shell of what was once my parents' bookstore. 6 months ago, this place was alive. Shelves packed with stories from floor to ceiling, the quiet murmur of readers lost in different worlds, and my mom's collection of wind chimes tinkling by the door whenever someone walked in. Now it's just me, the dust, and 4 bare walls that used to be my whole world. I run my fingers along the indent in the wall where the mystery section used to be. Dad had installed those shelves himself when I was 10. I remember holding the level while he hammered, telling me how one day all of this would be mine. Books are magic, Elijah, he'd say. They're portals to 1,000 lives you'll never live. And we're the keepers of the portals. Pretty deep for a guy who also thought putting pineapple on pizza was a height of culinary innovation. Growing up in Mason Creek, Pennsylvania, population barely 5,000, that bookstore was everything to me. While other kids dreamed of leaving our nowhere town the minute they got their diplomas, I was the weirdo who actually wanted to stay. Mason Creek isn't much. We got 2 traffic lights, a diner where the coffee tastes like it was brewed in 1987, and a high school football team that hasn't won a game since Obama's first term. But we had the only bookstore in 3 counties, and to me, that made it special. It wasn't supposed to end like this. The accident happened on a rainy Tuesday last October. Mom and Dad were driving back from a book convention in Pittsburgh when a semi lost control on the wet highway. The police said it was instant. I like to think they were discussing which new releases they were most excited to stock, right until the end. Dad would have been going on about some obscure sci-fi novel, while Mom pretended to listen, while secretly planning where to put the romance section's newest editions. When the fog of the funeral cleared and reality set in, I discovered my parents hadn't left a will. Classic Thomas and Emily Turner. They could recite passages from The Great Gatsby from memory, but somehow never got around to basic adult responsibilities like estate planning. I wasn't worried at first. I was their only child, and everyone knew the bookstore was meant for me. But then Aunt Meredith and Uncle Paul swooped in from their fancy lives in Philadelphia, talking about family obligations and legal formalities. "We'll handle everything," Aunt Meredith said, her perfectly manicured hand patting mine. "You're grieving, sweetheart. The last thing you need is to worry about paperwork and legalities." She was wearing a black pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly rent and smelled like that perfume. They only sell department stores where they give you judgmental looks if you just want a free sample. I'd always liked my aunt and uncle, even though we only saw them at holidays. They sent me birthday cards with $20 bills when I was a kid and didn't completely ignore me at family gatherings like my cousins did, when they suggested I sign some papers to streamline the inheritance process. I didn't think twice. They were family. Why would I question them? God, I was so stupid. It turns out that under Pennsylvania intestacy laws, when someone dies without a will, their siblings get a portion of the estate if the deceased has no spouse. My parents' bookstore, valued at nearly $300,000, should have been split with me getting the majority and my aunt and uncle receiving smaller shares. But those papers I signed, they were a waiver of my inheritance rights, a complete surrender. The kind of thing any person with half a brain and a basic understanding of legal terms would never sign without a lawyer. I discovered this 3 weeks later when I went to the store to start learning the books and operations, only to find a for sale sign in the window. That's when it hit me like a truck. The same way those self-help books in aisle 3 use to tell people that realizations can be physically painful. They weren't lying. When I confronted them at their hotel, the only decent one in Mason Creek, which isn't saying much, Uncle Paul barely looked up from his golf magazine. He was lounging in an armchair with his feet up on the coffee table, looking like every stereotype of middle-aged man who thinks his golf handicap is a personality trait. "We're liquidating the assets. Elijah, it's the sensible thing to do." He flipped a page of his magazine, completely unbothered. Nobody reads physical books anymore anyway. It's all Kindle this, audiobook that. But the store was supposed to be mine, I said, my voice embarrassingly small. Mom and Dad always said, What they always said doesn't matter legally. Aunt Meredith cut in, looking up from her phone, where she was probably checking the stock market or whatever people with money do all day. They should have put it in writing if it was so important. Besides, do you have any idea how to run a business? You're a 25-year-old with an English degree and no experience. You'd run it into ground in a year. The worst part was, deep down, I worried she might be right. I'd worked at the store since high school, but Mom and Dad handled all the business side of things. I knew where every book belonged and could recommend something perfect based on a vague description like that blue one with the guy on the cover. But I had no idea how to do taxes or order inventory or deal with insurance. Still, I would have learned. I would have preserved their legacy. The sale went through faster than I thought possible. Some developer bought the property. Apparently, they're turning it into yet another coffee shop. Like Mason Creek needs another one. This town already has 3 coffee shops for 5,000 people. At this rate, we'll soon have more places to buy overpriced lattes than actual residents. Today is my last day to clear out any personal effects before the new owners take possession. The shelves are gone. The vintage reading chairs my mom loved, the ones she'd found at a yard sale, and reupholstered herself in this hideous floral pattern that somehow worked. The hand-painted sign my dad commissioned from a local artist when they opened 28 years ago. All gone. I spent the morning watching them rip out the old oak counter where I used to sit as a kid, doing homework while Mom ran the register. There was a spot underneath where I'd carved my initials with a paperclip. When I was 7, Mom had been so mad, but Dad had laughed and said it meant I was officially part of the store's history. Now that counter is probably headed for a landfill. Uncle Paul showed up as I was looking around the empty space. He had the audacity to toss me a small box like he was doing me some huge favor. His BMW was parked outside, freshly washed and probably paid for with my inheritance. Here's your inheritance, kiddo, your parents' personal book collection. About 30 dusty paperbacks, and that old-fashioned record player your dad was so attached to, couldn't get more than $50 for it. So consider it a gift. He straightened his golf polo. The guy literally wore golf clothes everywhere, like he needed to be ready for an emergency tea time at any moment. I caught the box reflexively, my fingers gripping the cardboard so hard it started to bend. What about the money from the sale? My voice was shaking. I should at least get. He laughed. It was the kind of laugh that makes you feel small, like when you accidentally use the wrong fork at a fancy restaurant and everyone notices. You sign it away, college boy. Maybe you should have read what you were signing. Consider this a $250,000 lesson in being smarter next time. I wanted to throw the box at his smug face. I wanted to scream that my parents would be disgusted by what he'd done. But I just stood there, clutching my cardboard box of memories while he checked his watch as if he had somewhere more important to be. When he left, I sat down on the floor of the empty store with my box of inheritance. 32 books, to be exact. My dad's favorites, his worn copy of Moby Dick with notes in the margins, my mom's first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird that she'd saved up for years to buy, a few classics, some obscure science fiction novels my dad loved. The books still smelled like home, like the store, like my parents. And at the bottom of the box, the old Victrola gramophone that had sat in the corner of the store for as long as I could remember. Dad would play old jazz records on Sunday afternoons. The sound was scratchy and imperfect, but he swore it had more soul than any digital music ever would. Music should have texture, he'd insist, while my teenage self rolled my eyes and went back to my Spotify playlist. There's your empire, dreamer, Uncle Paul had said from the doorway before he left. Good luck building something with that. He'd said it with the confidence of a man who's never faced real consequences for being awful. He probably expected me to sling away to my rented apartment above the hardware store, the only place in town I could afford on a bookstore clerk's salary, and nurse my wounds with cheap beer and Netflix. I should have felt defeated. I did, partially. But sitting there on the floor of what used to be my future, something else started burning in my chest. The same feeling I got when some literary snob would come into the store and laugh at my dad's sci-fi collection, or when my high school English teacher said that wanting to run a bookstore was setting the bar a little low. I opened my mom's copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, and a folded piece of paper fell out. Her handwriting, a quote she copied down. Real courage is when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway and see it through no matter what. Maybe I was licked, my inheritance stolen, my plans derailed, my family revealed as vultures. But that didn't mean I was finished. I carefully packed the books and the gramophone back into the box. These weren't just old things. They were the seeds of something new. I just didn't know it yet. As I carried my box out to my car, a 2003 Honda Civic with more rust than paint and a check engine light that's been on so long I consider a permanent feature, Uncle Paul called out from across the parking lot. "There's your empire dreamer," he shouted with a smirk, gesturing at my pathetic box of leftover memories. Good luck building something with that. I placed the box carefully on my passenger seat and took one last look at the empty storefront. The sign was already gone, replaced by a generic "coming soon," being their coffee CO. Banner. 30 years of my family's legacy erased for another place to buy overpriced lattes. I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Uncle Paul thought he'd won, that I'd just accept this and move on, maybe get some corporate job and forget about my parents' dream and mine. But looking at that old gramophone and those worn books, something stirred inside me, a feeling I hadn't experienced since before the funeral. Something like determination. "We'll see about that," I muttered, started my car with a defiant turn of the key. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but I knew one thing for certain. My story wasn't ending here. It was just beginning. 3 weeks after watching my parents' bookstore transform into another generic coffee shop, I was sitting on a threadbare couch in my apartment above Hank's Hardware, scrolling through social media like a masochist. My place wasn't much. A studio with creaky floors, a kitchenette that could barely fit a microwave, and a bathroom where you had to sit sideways on the toilet if you were taller than 5 feet 10 inches. But it was all I could afford on what was left of my bookstore clerk salary. The worst part of my morning ritual wasn't the instant coffee or the neighbor's cat that somehow always found its way into my apartment. It was checking Facebook and seeing Aunt Meredith's latest update. Breaking in my new lake house this weekend. Hashtag bless hashtag lakeside hashtag new beginnings. The photos showed Aunt Meredith posing on the deck of a sprawling 2-story home on Lake Erie with her husband Ted, a guy I've met maybe twice at family gatherings. The kind of place with floor-to-ceiling windows and one of those kitchens with an island bigger than my entire apartment. Must be nice to renovate your lifestyle with someone else's inheritance. I scrolled down further, and there it was, Uncle Paul's latest post. He was standing proudly next to his new baby, a gleaming white yacht with second wind, painted on the side in navy blue letters. His wife Charlotte was smiling beside him, champagne glass in hand. The irony of the name wasn't lost on me. Their second wind was powered by the storm that destroyed mine. My phone buzzed with a notification. Speak of the devil. Uncle Paul was calling. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hey there, bookworm. Just checking in on my favorite nephew. How's life treating you?" His voice had that artificial cheer people use when they're really saying, "Look how much better I'm doing than you." I could hear waves lapping in the background and imagine him calling from the deck of his blood money boat. My blood instantly boiled. This man had helped steal my inheritance, my future, and now he was calling to gloat? "What do you want, Paul?" I snapped, gripping the phone so hard I thought it might crack. He chuckled, clearly enjoying my anger. "Whoa there. Someone woke up on the wrong side of the futon today. Just thought I'd check how my nephew is surviving in the real world." Cut the crap. We both know why you're calling. You want to rub it in. "Hey, how's that gramophone working out? Still got it, or did you have to pawn it to make rent this month?" I looked over at Dad's old Victrola sitting on my makeshift coffee table, a wooden crate from a hardware store. It was the only thing of real value I had left. You know what? When I get back what you stole from me, and I will, I'm going to remember every single one of these calls. I said, my voice shaking with rage. He laughed outright now. Big threats from a small man. "Look, if you ever need a few bucks, let me know. I might take that gramophone off your hands. Make a nice conversation piece in my boathouse. The boathouse. He had a separate house for his boat. Meanwhile, I was eating ramen for the third night in a row. Go to hell, I said. Such hostility. Just so, you know, Meredith's having a housewarming party next month. Told me to invite you. Might want to get yourself something nice to wear, though it's black tie. After hanging up, I hurled my phone across the room. It hit the wall with a crack before falling to the floor. Great. Now I had a spider web of cracks across my screen to remind me of this conversation every time I looked at it. I had spent weeks researching legal options, only to discover that I didn't have any. I'd signed those papers willingly. No coercion, no fraud, just my own stupid trust and family. Every lawyer I called, which was exactly two, since that's all I could afford, said the same thing. I had no case. Blood might be thicker than water, but money trumps both. The gramophone sat there, almost mocking me with its presence. I hadn't actually played it since bringing it home. Part of me was afraid that hearing it would just make me miss my parents more. But today, fueled by anger and the special kind of desperation that comes from watching people enjoy what should have been yours, I wound it up. I found one of Dad's old records in the box, Duke Ellington. As the first scratchy notes filled my tiny apartment, something shifted inside me. It wasn't peace or acceptance. It was resolve. Some people might call it spite. I was going to find a way to get back what was mine. I didn't know how yet, but sitting in that apartment, listening to jazz from another era, I made a promise to myself and to my parents' memory. November in Pennsylvania is no joke. The wind cuts through your clothes like they're made of tissue paper, and the rain always seems to be just cold enough to make you miserable without turning to snow. I was walking home from my new job at Barnes & Noble. The irony wasn't lost on me when I spotted him. An old man was huddled in the doorway of what used to be Mason Creek's movie theater before streaming killed it. He was playing a violin, the case open at his feet, with maybe $2 in change inside. His fingers were red from the cold, but the melody was surprisingly beautiful. Something classical that I vaguely recognized from my mom's favorite playlist. Most people were hurrying past, heads down against the wind, trying to get home to warmth and dinner. I should have been doing the same. My bank account was hovering just above empty, and I had bills due in 3 days. But something about the old man's dignity as he played to an audience of no one made me stop. He finished his piece and looked up, surprised to see someone actually listening. That was amazing, I said, fishing out the $5 bill I'd been saving for a coffee tomorrow morning. It wasn't much, but it was something. Thank you, young man. Mozart sounds best with frozen fingers, didn't you know? His voice had a slight accent I couldn't place, and despite the circumstances, his eyes had a mischievous twinkle. I'm Elijah, I said, noticing how the wind was making him shiver. Henry, he replied, tucking his violin under his arm to shake my hand. His grip was surprisingly firm for someone who looked like a strong breeze might knock him over. I glanced up at the darkening sky. The weather report had mentioned sleet later. Do you have somewhere to go tonight? I asked. It's supposed to get nasty out here. Henry shrugged, the gesture making him seem suddenly smaller in his worn peacoat. The shelter on Pine Street, if they have room. If not, I know a few spots where the wind isn't so bad. I should have just given him directions to the shelter and gone on my way. That would have been the sensible thing to do. But sensible wasn't really working out for me lately. I have a couch, I heard myself saying, and tea. It's not much, but it's warm. That's how I ended up sharing my last box of mac and cheese with a 70-something street musician in my tiny apartment. Henry didn't talk much about himself at first, just commented on my books and asked if I played any instruments. When I told him about my parents and their bookstore, he listened with the kind of attention that's become rare these days. No checking phones or thinking about what to say next, just listening. So your relatives stole your inheritance, he said when I finished, shaking his head. People will surprise you with their capacity for cruelty, especially family. They know exactly where to stick the knife. Something about the way he said it made me think Henry knew a thing or two about family betrayal. The worst part is watching him flaunt it. I admitted, new house, new boat, vacations, all while I'm trying to figure out how to make rent. Henry nodded, looking thoughtfully at the gramophone. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward it. I nodded, and he wound it up with practiced hands, carefully placing the needle. Duke Ellington filled the room again. "Beautiful instrument," he said. "They don't make them like this anymore. Everything now is digital, convenient, no soul." He closed his eyes for a moment, swaying slightly to the music. "You know, I played with a jazz band in New Orleans for almost 20 years. Not the famous ones, mind you, but we had our moments." As the night wore on and the sleet tapped against my windows, Henry shared stories of his life on the road, playing in smoky clubs, touring with bands that almost made it big, and eventually ending up alone with just his violin and memories. "What happened?" I asked. "To your band, I mean." "Life happened," he said with a small shrug. "Some died, some got real jobs, some got lost in their vices. I just kept playing. Music was never what I did. It's who I am." Around midnight, as I was making up the couch with my spare sheets, slightly threadbare but clean, Henry reached into his battered duffel bag. "I want you to have something," he said, pulling out a worn leather-bound book. "It's not much, but it's a thank you for your kindness. Kindness is rare these days. It should be rewarded." The book was old, its pages yellowed and slightly warped. Sheet music. "I can't take this," I protested. "I don't even play an instrument." "It's not about playing," Henry said, pressing it into my hands. "It's about stories. Every piece of music tells a story. And you, Elijah Turner, seem like someone who appreciates a good story." Henry's eyes had that twinkle again. "Found it in a dumpster behind the Paramount Theater in Pittsburgh years ago. Someone's treasure tossed away. Seemed fitting to pass it to you. One discarded treasure to another." I accepted the book, not wanting to refuse his gesture. After all, it was probably one of the few possessions he had to give. As Henry settled onto the couch, I placed the book on my small bookshelf, next to my dad's favorite novels and my mom's dog-eared poetry collection. I had no idea that the battered book of sheet music would change everything, that sometimes the universe has a strange way of balancing the scales of justice, that my story was about to take a turn I never could have imagined. But that's life, isn't it? The most important chapters often begin with the smallest gestures. A kindness to a stranger, a gift with no agenda, and a weathered book of music that looked worthless to anyone who didn't know how to read between the lines. Henry was gone by the time I woke up the next morning. He'd left a note thanking me for the hospitality and saying he had a bus to catch to Pittsburgh. The couch was neatly made, and he'd even washed the mugs we'd used for tea. The only evidence he'd been there at all was the worn music book on my shelf. For the next few days, I barely thought about Henry or his gift. I was too busy working double shifts at Barnes & Noble, trying to make enough to cover both rent and the phone repair bill. Turns out throwing your phone at the wall in anger is satisfying for about 3 seconds and expensive for much longer. Who knew? Life settled into a depressing routine. Work, cheap takeout, scrolling past my relatives, social media gloating, sleep, repeat. I tried not to think about the bookstore or what could have been. Tried not to check if the coffee shop that replaced it was thriving. Tried to ignore the sick feeling in my stomach every time I passed it on my way to work. Then came the rainy Friday night that changed everything. I'd just gotten home from a particularly brutal shift. My manager, Karen, yes, her actual name, and yes, she lived up to the stereotype, had chewed me out for not pushing enough membership cards on customers. My shoes were soaked from the walk home in the downpour, and I'd used my last clean towel to dry them off. The instant ramen I'd planned to eat for dinner had mysteriously disappeared, probably courtesy of my neighbor's teenage son, who occasionally borrowed food when I forgot to lock my door. In short, I was having what my mom would have called a real 5-star day. That was our family code for when everything goes wrong, but you're too stubborn to admit you need help. I flopped onto the couch and reached for the gramophone, craving the comfort of my dad's jazz records. As Duke Ellington's Mood Indigo filled my apartment with its melancholy warmth, my eyes wandered to my pitiful bookshelf. The collection seemed so small now, just a handful of memories compared to the thousands of books that had once surrounded me in the store. That's when I noticed Henry's music book again. 3 weeks had passed since he'd given it to me, and I hadn't so much as opened it. Feeling a twinge of guilt, I got up and pulled it from the shelf. The book was heavier than it looked. The leather binding was cracked with age, but still intact. No title on the spine or cover. I opened it carefully, half expecting the pages to crumble. They didn't. Inside was sheet music, as expected. Handwritten, not printed. The first page had no title, just the date, July 1937. Something about that tickled my memory, but I couldn't place it. I flipped through a few more pages, admiring precise notation, even though I couldn't read music. Then I saw the signature at the bottom of one page. G. Gershwin. I almost dropped the book. George Gershwin, one of the most famous American composers of all time. Rhapsody in Blue. An American in Paris. The opera Porgy and Bess. My mom had loved his music. She'd played in the store on Sunday mornings. But Gershwin died in 1937, the same year written on the first page. My heart started racing. No way. It couldn't be. This had to be a copy, a reproduction, maybe something Henry had written himself as a tribute. There was no chance a homeless violinist just happened to give me an original Gershwin manuscript he found in a dumpster. Life isn't that convenient. Not for people like me. I grabbed my laptop and started Googling. George Gershwin. Death, 1937 July. His final illness. He was working on several projects before he died, including the film score for the Goldwyn Follies. Then I found something interesting. A music history blog mentioned rumors of an unfinished symphony Gershwin had been composing in his final months, a piece that was supposed to combine classical structure with jazz and folk influences in a way even more ambitious than Rhapsody in Blue. But according to music historians, no manuscript had ever been found. It was considered lost to history. I looked back at the worn book in my hands. The date, the signature, the complete set of handwritten sheet music. My palms were sweating now. I needed someone who knew more than me. Someone who could tell if this was real or just an elaborate fake. Someone who wouldn't try to steal it if it was valuable. That someone was Alicia Martinez. We dated briefly in college before realizing we were better as friends and partners. She was now the head research librarian at the Mason Creek Public Library. With a master's degree in music history, she wasn't using nearly enough in our small town. I texted her, "Need your expert eyes on something. Free for lunch tomorrow? I'll buy." Her response came quickly. "You buying lunch means either the world is ending or you need a big favor. Either way, I'm in. 12:30 at Gino's." I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the music book on my nightstand, glancing at it every few minutes like it might disappear if I looked away too long. What were the odds that a random act of kindness would lead to something like this? If it was even real, it probably wasn't. Things like this didn't happen to people who get their inheritance stolen by their aunt and uncle. By morning, I convinced myself I was being ridiculous. The signature was probably fake. The book was likely just some music student's homework from decades ago. Nothing to lose sleep over. But I still carried it to lunch in my backpack, wrapped in a plastic bag to protect it from any stray raindrops. Alicia was already at Gino's when I arrived, tucked into our usual booth by the window. She looked exactly as she always did, curly black hair pulled into a messy bun, glasses perched on her nose, some obscure band t-shirt under her cardigan. She had a way of making even the most ordinary outfit look like a deliberate fashion choice. After ordering our usual pepperoni for her, mushroom for me, I told her the whole story. My parents, the bookstore, my thieving relatives, Henry, the book. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the reasons we'd remain friends. Alicia knew when to talk and when to just let someone get it all out. When I finally pulled out the book and slid across the table, she put on the white cotton gloves she'd brought along, because of course Alicia would have archival gloves in her purse. "Elijah Turner," she said as she carefully opened the cover. "Only you would accidentally end up with what might be a lost manuscript while trying to be a decent human being." She examined the pages methodically, her expression growing more intense with each turn. At one point, she pulled out her phone and compared something in the book to an image online. Then she looked up at me, her eyes wide behind her glasses. Oh, my goodness. Coming from Alicia, who is usually calm and collected, this reaction was significant. Is it real? I asked, barely breathing. I can't authenticate it with 100% certainty without proper equipment and tests, she said, slipping back into her professional librarian voice. But Eli, if this is a fake, it's the most impressive fake I've ever seen. She pointed to specific notations, explaining how they matched Gershwin's known style, how the paper and ink appeared period appropriate, how the composition itself reflected themes Gershwin was exploring in his final works. This looks like his final symphony, she whispered, reverence in her voice. The one music historians have been searching for since his death. Eli, do you understand what this means? I didn't. Not fully. Not yet. Alicia helped me contact an expert at the music department at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. She vouched for me, assuring Professor that I wasn't some scammer with a fake manuscript looking for attention. 2 agonizing weeks later, I was sitting in Professor Daniel Warren's office while he examined the book with equipment that looked like it belonged in a sci-fi movie. The paper dates to the 1930s, he confirmed, looking up from his analysis. The ink composition is consistent with what would have been used then. The handwriting matches authenticated Gershwin manuscripts we have in our collection. He removed his glasses and looked at me with an intensity that made me nervous. Mr. Turner, I believe you have found George Gershwin's Lost Symphony. My ears started ringing. I gripped the arms of my chair. How? How much would something like this be worth? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Professor Warren looked thoughtful. That's difficult to say precisely. But for comparison, a single page of Gershwin's handwritten sheet music for Rhapsody in Blue sold at auction for $60,000 in 2018. This is an entire symphony, his final work, presumed lost forever. We're talking about a treasure of American musical history. He suggested I contact Sotheby's in New York, the premier auction house for valuable manuscripts. With a letter of preliminary authentication from him, they would take my claims seriously. The next month passed in a blur. I took time off work, using vacation days I'd been saving for a trip I could no longer afford. I made multiple trips to New York, carrying the manuscript in a fireproof, waterproof case Alicia had insisted I buy. Sotheby's experts performed their own authentication processes, which involved more tests than I knew existed. Throughout it all, I kept expecting someone to tell me it was all a mistake, that the book was worthless, that I was a fool for hoping. But that moment never came. Instead, I found myself sitting across from Victoria Chong, one of Sotheby's top specialists in music manuscripts, as she slid a document across her desk. Our final assessment values the manuscript at approximately $1 million, she said matter-of-factly, as though she wasn't completely appending my existence with a single sentence. As the complete final symphony of George Gershwin, previously believed lost to history, it represents a significant discovery in American musical heritage. $1 million. More money than I would make in 20 years at Barnes & Noble. More than 3 times what my parents' bookstore had sold for. The auction is scheduled for 3 weeks from now, Victoria continued, seemingly unaware that my brain had short-circuited. Based on the interest we've already received from collectors and institutions, we expect the bidding to be quite competitive. It could potentially sell for significantly more than our valuation. I nodded automatically, still struggling to process. A month ago, I'd been eating ramen for dinner and worrying about making rent. Now I was discussing million-dollar auctions in an office that probably cost more per month than my entire apartment building. Mr. Turner, do you have any questions? Victoria prompted. I had 1,000 questions, but they all boiled down to one. Was this really happening? That night in my hotel room, paid for by Sotheby's as part of their client services, I called Alicia. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up, I told her, staring out at the New York skyline from my window, that none of this is real. It's real, Eli, she assured me. Sometimes the universe has a way of balancing the scales. You lost your inheritance, but you gained something even more valuable. I thought about that for a while after we hung up, about how a random act of kindness toward a stranger had completely changed my life trajectory. about how Henry had given me this priceless gift without knowing its value. Or maybe he had known. I'd probably never find out. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't help but think about Uncle Paul and Aunt Meredith, about their new houses and boats and cars, all bought with what should have been my inheritance, about their smug certainty that they'd won, that I would spend my life struggling while they enjoyed the fruits of my parents' labor. I reached for my phone and pulled up Facebook. Aunt Meredith had just posted photos from her housewarming party. #blessed #dream home. For the first time, the sight didn't fill me with rage or despair. Instead, I felt something new, something that felt strangely like anticipation. The universe really does have a way of balancing the scales. In 3 weeks, I would be a millionaire. The Lost Symphony of George Gershwin, one of America's greatest composers, would be sold to the highest bidder, and its discovery would be credited to Elijah Turner, former bookstore clerk from Mason Creek, Pennsylvania. But what would I do with the money? How would I use this unexpected twist of fate? That night, as I drifted off to sleep in a hotel room that cost more per night than my monthly rent, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about the money. This was about justice. This was about honoring my parents' legacy. And maybe, just maybe, about teaching my dear aunt and uncle that karma has a wicked sense of humor. The morning of the auction arrived with a sense of unreality. I'd barely slept the night before, my mind racing with possibilities. What if the manuscript didn't sell? What if it went for less than expected? What if someone challenged my ownership? The anxiety of sudden potential fortune was almost worse than the steady certainty of being broke. I'd rented a suit for the occasion, charcoal gray with a blue tie that my mom would have said brought out my eyes. Standing in front of the mirror in my hotel room, I hardly recognized myself. I looked like someone important, someone with prospects, someone who belonged in the gleaming auction room at Sotheby's instead of stocking bestsellers at Barnes & Noble. Victoria from Sotheby's had arranged for a car to pick me up, not a taxi or an Uber, but a sleek black Lincoln with a driver in a crisp uniform who called me Mr. Turner without a hint of irony. As we glided through Manhattan traffic, I pressed my forehead against the cool window glass, watching the city blur past. 3 months ago, I'd been contemplating whether I could afford to fix my ancient Honda's air conditioning. Now I was being chauffeured to an auction where people would bid millions for something I owned. Life comes at you fast, as the memes say. The auction room at Sotheby's looked exactly like something from a movie, elegant wood paneling, plush chairs, subtle lighting that highlighted the importance of what was happening without being flashy about it. Old money in architectural form. Victoria met me in a private waiting area, looking polished and confident in a navy pantsuit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. "Your manuscript is lot 42, she explained, handing me a glossy catalog. "We positioned it as the centerpiece of today's auction. There's been significant interest from several major institutions and private collectors." I flipped through the catalog until I found it. There, spread across 2 pages, was a photograph of the first page of Gershwin's symphony alongside a scholarly description of its significance. And at the bottom, in smaller text, "Property of Elijah Turner, discovered 2025. My name, in a Sotheby's catalog. My parents would have been over the moon. Victoria guided me to a reserved seat in the auction room, explaining that I could choose to remain anonymous, but I declined. If this was really happening, I wanted my name attached to it. I wanted people to know that Elijah Turner from Mason Creek, Pennsylvania, had discovered George Gershwin's Lost Symphony. I wanted my aunt and uncle to see it. The auction began precisely at 10:30 a.m. I watched, fascinated, as various valuable items were presented and sold with remarkable efficiency. A rare first edition of The Great Gatsby went for $240,000. A collection of letters from Ernest Hemingway fetched nearly $500,000. Each sale was marked by the sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel, a sound that would soon determine my financial future. As Lot 42 approached, my palms grew sweaty. I tried to remember to breathe. The room seemed to grow quieter, or maybe that was just the blood rushing in my ears. "Lot 42, the auctioneer announced, his voice like polished mahogany. "The recently discovered final symphony of George Gershwin, composed July 1937, a complete manuscript in the composer's hand. Previously believed lost to history. We'll start the bidding at $800,000. A paddle went up immediately. Then another, and another. 900,000. 1 million. 1.2 million. The numbers climbed with dizzying speed. A representative from the Library of Congress, a Japanese technology billionaire known for his music collection, a prestigious university. The bidding narrowed to two determined parties, the Metropolitan Museum of Art and an anonymous phone bidder represented by one of Sotheby's staff. 3 million. 3.2 million. 3.4 million. I'd stopped breathing entirely. These numbers weren't real. Couldn't be real. The auctioneer looked toward the phone bidder, who shook his head after a moment. 3.4 million going once, going twice. The crack of the gavel echoed to the room like a thunderclap. Sold to the Metropolitan Museum of Art for $3.4 million. $3.4 million. For a book of sheet music that a homeless violinist had given me as thanks for a cup of tea and a night on my couch. Victoria squeezed my arm, her professional facade cracking slightly to reveal genuine excitement. Congratulations, Mr. Turner. You've just made history. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork, meetings with financial advisors, and calls with the Sotheby's legal team. After their commission and taxes, I would clear just over $2.7 million. More money than I had ever imagined possessing. I booked a first-class ticket back to Pennsylvania, but before leaving New York, I had an important stop to make. The Metropolitan Museum had already arranged for the Gershwin manuscript to be transferred to their musical archives, and the curator had kindly agreed to meet with me. Dr. Ellen Orchin greeted me warmly in her office. Surrounded by climate-controlled display, cases containing treasures of musical history. Mr. Turner, I wanted to personally thank you for your discovery, she said. This manuscript will be the centerpiece of our American music collection. We're planning a special exhibition next year, exploring Gershwin's influence on American cultural identity. She showed me where the manuscript will be displayed. A custom-built case with special lighting and temperature controls to preserve the aging paper and ink. A small plaque would note its discovery by one Elijah Turner. Your name will be permanently associated with this important piece of American cultural heritage, Dr. Chin explained. Scholars and music lovers for generations will know your contribution. It struck me then that this was far more than just a financial windfall. I had become part of something bigger, part of the story of American music itself. My parents, with their love of books and art and history, would have understood the significance in a way that went beyond the money. As I left the museum, I stood for a moment on the grand steps overlooking Fifth Avenue. The city hummed around me, indifferent to my personal transformation. Yet something had fundamentally shifted in my universe. I had options now, possibilities, a future that wasn't shaped by financial struggle or the bitter taste of family betrayal. I pulled out my phone and called Alicia. I think I know what I'm going to do with the money, I told her. Let me guess, she replied. It involves books. You know me too well. When I returned to Mason Creek, I didn't immediately broadcast my newfound wealth. I wanted time to get my bearings to make plans. I gave notice at Barnes & Noble, though I couldn't resist telling Karen exactly what I thought of her management style on my way out, and started quietly looking at commercial real estate. There was a historic building on Main Street that had once been the town's first bank. It had stood empty for years, too expensive for most local businesses to consider. With its oak paneling, tall windows, and built-in bookshelves from its brief stint as a law office, it was perfect for what I had in mind. I also began reaching out to contacts in the rare book world, dealers, collectors, and experts who could help me build the kind of inventory I wanted. My parents had taught me enough about valuable books to know what I was looking for, and with Alicia's help researching provenances and authenticities, I began assembling a collection that would make any bibliophile's heart race. 3 months after the auction, Turner's Treasures opened its doors. Not just a bookstore, but a carefully curated collection of rare books, music manuscripts, and cultural artifacts. The kind of place where enthusiasts would drive hours to browse, where collectors would come to find that one perfect addition to their library. where people who loved the smell of old paper and the weight of history in their hands would feel at home. The grand opening was covered by the local newspaper, which led to a feature in the Philadelphia Inquirer, which somehow caught the attention of a culture writer at the New York Times. Before I knew it, I was being interviewed for a Sunday profile. From gramophone to millions, how one man's act of kindness led to a musical treasure. The article detailed the whole story. My parents' bookstore, the inherited gramophone, Henry the homeless violinist, the Gershwin manuscript. The writer positioned it as a feel-good tale of karma and serendipity, complete with professional photos of me standing proudly in my new establishment. I made sure to mention my aunt and uncle by name when discussing how the family bookstore had been taken from me after my parents' death. The reporter, sensing a juicy angle, included that detail prominently. The day the article appeared online, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. Friend from high school I hadn't heard from in years. Former customers from my parents' store. Random people on social media congratulating me. And buried among them, a text from Uncle Paul. Quite the fairy tale you're spinning for the papers. We should talk. I didn't respond. 2 days later, a sleek BMW pulled up outside Turner's Treasures. Uncle Paul, looking oddly diminished without his usual smugness, pushed through the front door like he owned the place. Some habits die hard, I guess. He stopped short when he saw the interior. The gleaming oak shelves filled with leather-bound treasures. The climate-controlled display cases containing first editions worth more than his yacht. The tasteful lighting that highlighted the store's architectural features while protecting the valuable merchandise from damaging UV rays. I was helping a customer, a music professor from Princeton, who was examining a rare collection of Chopin sheet music. When Paul approached the antique desk I used as a checkout counter, "Elijah," he said, with a strained attempt at warmth, "you've done well for yourself." I finished with my customer before acknowledging him. "What do you want, Paul?" His eyes darted around, taking the obvious success surrounding us. "Can we talk privately?" I led him to my office in the back, a space I'd modeled after my dad's office in the original bookstore, right down to the worn leather chair and the black and white photos of famous authors on the walls. "This is quite the operation you've got," he said, sitting down without being invited to. "Very impressive. Again, what do you want?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Look, about that article, you made it sound like Meredith, and I deliberately cheated you. That's not fair. We were just following the legal process. You signed those papers. Taking advantage of someone's grief isn't illegal, but it doesn't make it right." I replied, keeping my voice level. "Is that really why you came here? To complain about looking bad in the New York Times?" He cleared his throat. "Actually, Meredith and I have hit a rough patch financially. The market's been unpredictable, and some investments didn't pan out. Since you're family and clearly doing well now, we thought perhaps you might consider helping out. A loan, maybe, or some kind of family partnership." The audacity was breathtaking. I almost admired it. "Let me make sure I understand," I said slowly. "You stole my inheritance, mocked me for my financial struggles, and now that I've made my own success, you want me to bail you out?" "We didn't steal. You manipulated me into signing away my rights during the worst period of my life, then laughed about it afterward. You called to gloat about your new boat while I was eating ramen for dinner. You literally told me, good luck building something, with nothing but a box of books and a gramophone." His face reddened. "That was just talk, Elijah. Family says things in the heat of the moment. Water under the bridge." "No," I said, rising from my desk. "It's not water under the bridge. It's exactly who you are. And now you're facing the consequences of your own actions, just like I had to face the consequences of trusting you. So you won't help?" His voice had an ugly edge now. After all that sanctimonious talk in the Times about kindness and karma? I smiled. "I believe in kindness, Paul. I just don't believe in being taken advantage of twice by the same person. The exit is through the front door. Feel free to browse the merchandise on your way out, though I doubt there's anything here you could afford anymore." A week later, Aunt Meredith tried her luck. She arrived wearing her most expensive clothes, as if to remind me of her usual social standing. Unlike Paul, She came with a gift, a bottle of champagne, to celebrate your success. Her approach was more emotional. Tears about family discord. Appeals to what my parents would have wanted. Even a revisionist history, where she claimed she'd been against selling the bookstore, but had been overruled by Paul. The performance was almost impressive, but ultimately futile. I sent her away with the same message. You made your choice. Now live with it. It should have felt triumphant, these moments of revenge. In movies, this would be where the triumphant music swells. But honestly, it just felt sad. Sad that money was the only thing that made them see me as a person worthy of respect. Sad that even in the face of their own failure, they couldn't bring themselves to offer a genuine apology. The real triumph came 3 months later, when I finally managed to track down Henry. He wasn't easy to find. Street musicians tend not to have fixed addresses or social media presences. But through a network of shelters, soup kitchens, and fellow musicians, I eventually located him in Pittsburgh. He was playing his violin in a park, his case open for tips, just as he had been the night I'd invited him in from the cold. The same dignified posture, the same soulful melodies that seemed to speak of both joy and sorrow. I waited until he finished his piece before approaching. His eyes widened in recognition, then crinkled with genuine pleasure. "The kind bookshop boy," he said, his voice exactly as I remembered. "What brings you to Pittsburgh?" "You," I answered honestly. "I've been looking for you. That book of sheet music you gave me, it turned out to be something special." I explained everything, the Gershwin manuscript, the auction, my new business. His weathered face registered first disbelief, then wonder. "I always thought it might be valuable to someone who understood music," he said. "But millions? God works in mysterious ways." Then came the moment I'd been planning for months. I offered Henry a job, official street musician for Turner's Treasures, playing outside the store to attract customers. I offered him an apartment above the store, similar to the one I'd once had above the hardware shop, but considerably nicer. And I offered him friendship, the kind that had been missing from both our lives. To my relief, he accepted. Now, a year after finding the Gershwin manuscript, Turner's Treasures is thriving. We've expanded to include a small performance space where local musicians play intimate concerts. Henry has become something of a local celebrity, his violin playing drawing tourists and locals alike. As for me, I found purpose beyond revenge or even financial success. My store has become a cultural hub for community, a place where history is preserved and shared, where art and literature are celebrated, where curious minds can discover treasures they never knew existed. In my private office, I keep 2 photographs on my desk. One is of my parents on the day they opened their bookstore, their faces shining with pride and possibility. The other is of me at the Sotheby's auction, the moment my life changed forever. Between them sits Dad's old gramophone, the seemingly worthless inheritance that ultimately led to everything. Sometimes, late at night after the store is closed, I play one of his old jazz records and think about how life can change in an instant, how kindness can return to you in unexpected ways, how the things that seem like endings can become beginnings if you're brave enough to keep going. I think my parents would be proud, not of the success or the money, but the fact that I found a way to keep their legacy alive, a place where stories and music and history come together to create something meaningful. There's a recording of Gershwin's Lost Symphony now. The Metropolitan Museum commissioned a world-class orchestra to perform it from the manuscript. They sent me a copy, which I sometimes play on the store sound system. It's beautiful, soaring and complex and distinctly American. But to me, it sounds like something else too. It sounds like justice. It sounds like vindication. It sounds like the universe whispering that sometimes, just sometimes, things work out exactly as they should,